So I want to start off by reflecting on the motivation for this project, for the Comparative Study of Electoral Systems project, by asking you all to consider this question. What can we learn from comparing voters and elections? What can we learn from studying voters and elections across different contexts? So if you would like, you could drop some answers into the chat. If you would like to think about this for just a moment on your own, please do. Think about the types of research questions and discoveries that we might be able to tackle with a database that allows us to compare voters and elections. So I know you're thinking hard, even if you're not typing rapidly. I'm going to give you a few answers to this that come from the project itself. So one thing we can learn is that context shapes voter decisions. And here I don't mean just the output of voter decisions, but also what we might call the ingredients of voter decisions. So if we think of work by Anderson, in 2006, we have work that shows us how multi-level governance weakens incentives for economic voting. In other words, the classic paradigm that voters take into consideration the economy is something that's conditional on context, and that's something that we can see using CSES data. Blalock has some work from 2020 showing how corruption decreases ideological voting. So again, we learn how context changes the weight of the ingredients that go into voters' decisions. We can also learn about how context shapes political engagement. So Karp and Milazzo in 2016 have work showing us how adverse economic conditions motivate political participation. And Cornell has work showing us how institutions matter, institutions as context. So in this case, how open party nomination processes decrease political participation. We can also look at how elections shape public opinion. So we often think of elections as a way for the public to insert their opinion into politics, but we can use the CSES to understand how elections themselves shape public opinion. And in fact, I'm going to come back to this research in a few slides. We can learn about how representation shapes public opinion. So we can think, for example, of work by DeSonneville and McAllister, who show us how descriptive representation decreases the knowledge gap between genders. And we can also think about how party strategies shape partisanship and other factors. So Ponteson and Renwald show us in this 2017 work that uses CSES data that working class voters have a tendency to leave leftists, or have left and have a tendency to leave parties that appeal to the middle classes. So in other words, as I said, the nature of party strategies shapes the nature of a party's partisans. So it's these types of research frontiers that are the rationale for the CSES project. The CSES project allows us to understand how citizens engage in their democracies amid a diversity of electoral rules, political systems, economic contexts, party types, lines of conflict, and more. And it does this.
There is a suggestion in the chat of a topic from a.
Oh yeah, I see it. Thanks so much, Mike.
Yeah.
So precise understanding. Yeah, exactly. So how do different institutions and cultural differences shape attitudes on the most important issues of the day, as well as how those issues then translate into voter decisions? And there is some really nice work using CSES data on that topic, and yet more room for discovery in that area. So how does the CSES facilitate research on these types of questions? It does this by generating an extensive and unique database that is multi-country and multi-level. At the micro level, the database consists of national post-election survey data with a common core and a common theme. And at the macro level, the database contains all sorts of information on contextual factors, institutions, economic variables, and more. The CSES dataset is freely available, and it's possible to pull out of it both individual country studies as well as comprehensive, merged, and harmonized cross-national datasets. The database also contains bridging variables, which are variables that make it easy to connect the CSES data to other data sources. What that does is it multiplies the project's potential in terms of the types of research questions that you can address using the data. In all, the CSES database covers at this current point in time 229 elections from 57 countries. The project began in the 1990s, and it operates in 5 to 6 year waves, where each wave is distinguished by a theme. So on this page, this slide, I'm showing you the 5 modules that the database currently contains or represents. You can see, as I said, that the project began in the 1990s, and the first module was focused on issues related to the performance of democracy. The second module focused on accountability and representation. The third on the choices that people can make on political choices. The fourth on distributional politics and social protection. The fifth, most recent one, on populism. And the next module is currently in progress in the field, and I'll leave it as a little bit of a mystery. If you want to discover the theme for that module, you can go to the website and dig into that. Those data will be available starting a few years from now. If you're interested in digging into the database itself, what you have here on this slide represents the set of themes that are available to the current point in time, with the full release of the most recent module scheduled for sometime in the next year. The terminology that I'm using here when I say this database contains 5 modules, that is a reference to the notion that there's a theme module that it constitutes the core of the CSES project for each of these waves. And that module is a 10 to 15 minute respondent questionnaire with a specific substantive theme focus, as you can see, and as I've just run through. Now, as I mentioned, the data are freely available, and this is what the homepage for the project looks like. So if you go to www.ces.org, you'll find access to the data. I've, on the screenshot here, clicked on download data, and you can see that you can go further into that to get directly to the data. You can also look at a variable table if you're interested in kind of browsing through what's in the CSES database. You can look into data bridging. As I mentioned, the possibility of connecting the CSES to other data sources, and you can use the website to explore the project in a number of other ways as well. But this is where you will go to access the data. So to return to the rationale of the project for a minute, we can think of the project's 3 core goals in this way: to understand the cleavages that shape electoral outcomes and party systems, to illuminate how context shapes political beliefs and behavior, and to provide insight into variation in evaluations of democratic institutions. So for example, and I'm going to use this as a lead-in to telling you a little bit about some of my own work in progress that uses CSES data. For example, because of CSES, we know that elections increase satisfaction with democracy for at least some. You can think here or look and reference work by Arts and Thomason in 2008, and there's other work in this domain as well. Some of it that uses CSES data. We know that elections increase partisanship. So Singh and Thornton use CSES data to look at how partisanship is increased around election time. And we know that elections increase polarization. So here I'm referencing this really great work by Hernandez and Luisa Enrico, which recently won an award from the CSES project. So one question that we might have is, do elections also shape support for democracy? So I mentioned before that we often think of elections as the mechanism by which public opinion is translated into politics. But we might also think, as this slide suggests, of the ways that elections shape public opinion. And so one of the things that I have been looking into, along with a colleague of mine, Oscar Casarena, is this question: do elections shape support for democracy? So why might we care? So we might care about whether or not elections shape expressed allegiance to democracy for a couple of reasons. One of these is that the extent to which the public is committed to democracy as a regime type removes non-democratic options from consideration, at least from sort of explicit consideration by political leaders. So reduces we might say, the room to maneuver towards explicitly undemocratic policies. We also know from work by Chris Clausen that allegiance to democracy, support for democracy, fuels democratic stability, endurance, and deepening. So there's a connection that Chris Clausen has nicely documented between levels of support for democracy in countries and levels of democracy that itself, right? The level of democracy itself. So I think we should care about whether or not publics express high levels of support for democracy. And yet in a lot of the work that I do, I see variation in the public's commitment to democracy as a system. So I wanted to take a look at one factor that might account for some of this variation, and that's elections. The question, of course, is how might elections shape support for democracy? Will they shape support for democracy in a negative or in a positive way, if there is indeed an effect? And our argument is that there should be a positive connection on average. And this may sound sort of counterintuitive given the fact that I just reviewed the fact that elections stoke partisanship and polarization, but we argue that fundamentally elections are these deeply symbolic collective rituals. And when they occur, they demonstrate that democracy works. And we know from other research that a lot of people, when they're asked to think about what democracy means or what it's about, they think about elections. It's not the only thing they think about, but a lot of people put elections at the core of their conception of democracy. So when elections happen, it constitutes a very visible demonstration that elections work. And so we hypothesize that elections increase support for democracy. Now, the rival perspective is the one that I just alluded to, and that is that elections, because they're conflicts over power that fuel divisions, that they may undermine system confidence and actually pull people away from democracy. We know that around the globe, elections don't always proceed without some conflict, without sore feelings, without irregularities in some cases. And so it's very reasonable to think that our perspective is flawed, and that indeed, on average, what we should find is that elections sort of temporarily dampen support for democracy. But we enter a little bit more optimistically with the hypothesis I've highlighted in orange there. So how can we use CSES data to take a look at this? Well, in the second module of the CSES project, there's a question that asks about support for democracy. And it does so using what survey researchers think of as this Churchillian question, is that how we often refer to it. And we refer to it this way because Winston Churchill once said something very similar to what you see on the slide here, that democracy may have its problems, but it's better than any other form of government. And so it's very common for survey projects to include a question about support for democracy using this wording, asking people the extent to which they agree or disagree with this statement. So that's our dependent variable. And our independent variable is days since the election. And we control for age, gender, education, and country. And what we're looking for in the data is evidence of a boost following elections. Now, here's the thing to keep in mind. These are post-election surveys, right? So what does that mean for our research design? It means that what we're actually looking for is a sign that support tapers off as time, or tapers down, I should say, not tapers off. We hope it doesn't taper off entirely, but that it sort of trends downward following an election, the further you are away from the election in time. So that's why our key independent variable is days since the election. If there is a bump to support for democracy provided by elections, then we should see that the levels of support for democracy in the data are higher the closer or more proximate one is to the election. And here we can take advantage of the fact that even though all CSES surveys are administered post-election, the timing varies. So some are administered very quickly, effectively immediately after the election, and some are a few months, administered a few months later. So we're going to take advantage of that variation. And what we see in the data is evidence that indeed elections boost support for democracy. So what we predict from the analyses that we've run is shown here in the graph. Here's predicted support for democracy on this y-axis and days since the election on the x-axis. Here you have the time period represented as like immediately after the election. And you see that support for democracy on this 1 to 4 scale is up here. And as time passes, we see a decrease. It looks quite sharp, but keep your eye on the magnitude represented here on the y-axis. It's not, earth-shatteringly large in reality, but it is significant, that decrease that we see as we look out beyond the election as time goes by. So we are going to infer from that what elections have done is temporarily boosted support for democracy, and then we see a decay. So this is just an example of the type of research that you can conduct using CSES data. And with that, I'm going to transition to the last part that I want to cover here, which is how does CSES work? And as I said, I would like to talk a little bit about this because I think of you all who are here not only as potential consumers of the data or users of the data, but also as potential future contributors to the CSES project. Because ultimately the CSES project works because people contribute, and they contribute a lot of time and energy and resources to make it happen. So I see, before I move forward, that there's a question in the Q&A about whether or not we're using elections only in liberal democracies or also elections in competitive autocratic regimes. And the answer there is that we're using elections that are in the CSES Module 2 data set. So we're using everything that's available in that wave. That CSES effectively only includes democratic regimes, or at least sufficiently democratic regimes, in order to be able to carry out a high quality survey. So you can take a look on the CSES website at the list of countries that are included in each wave, but we used all the options for the Module 2. So how does CSES work, or who are these people who are contributing and making it work? The first sort of group of really important people are the country collaborators. So this is a data set that is compiled by a effectively decentralized process where country collaborators volunteer to fund data collection. They may be people who run the national election study in their country, and they offer to host or place the 10 to 15 minute module on one of their post-election surveys. So they fund the data collection, they translate the questions, they contribute to pre-testing modules when that's possible, and they adhere to the required high standards for sample design and data collection that are characteristic of the CSES project. They submit project data and reports, so their work doesn't end with the collection of the data, but it continues afterwards as they clean the data and submit it in a accessible way to the project along with reports. And they respond to queries on the data during and after processing. So the CSES collaborators are, I would say, maybe the unsung heroes of the project. I sort of hesitated over saying they're unsung because I hope that we all think of them when we use the data set, but I suspect that we often take data off the shelf and we don't think about who put all the resources and time and energy into actually collecting the data. So this is a volunteer service that country collaborators are providing to generate a public good. So hats off to them. They may be running, as I said, post-election surveys in their country. They may otherwise simply be able to find a way to generate a standalone survey after an election and place the questions on that. So the second group of people who are important to making CSES work are the planning committee members. This is the planning committee that I'm chairing. This is a global committee that comes together. It's comes together by way of nomination and then selection on the committee. And this is a committee that works to steward the project to completion and keep the project sort of meeting the highest standards possible and as inclusive as possible and as extensive as possible. So this is the group that issues and responds to a public call for proposals for theme modules. So you might have been thinking, why those theme modules? Well, because the planning committee issued a call for proposals and then responded to that call by evaluating the proposals that came in and selecting a theme to pursue for that module. That may be a theme that came directly out of one proposal, or for example, in the case of the populism module, it's a theme that emerged out of a, well, for lack of a better word, a theme that carried across several proposals. And the planning committee subcommittee on the theme module worked to kind of harmonize the ideas and develop out an instrument that reflected that input. The planning committee is divided into subcommittees that are focused on the theme, but also on survey methods, on core items, demographic questions that need to be included, and so on. And as I mentioned already, this is the group that develops the theme module, updates the core, macro, and other data instruments. It regularly meets to discuss subcommittee reports and new business items. These are individuals, some of whom are country collaborators, others are expert on cross-national survey research, and you can find the list of the planning committee as well as the country collaborators on the CSES website. This group of collaborators, the country collaborators, and then the members of the planning committee could not do their work without a foundational group that's holding everyone together. And this is the group that the project calls the Secretariat. And the Secretariat is located at the University of Michigan and in Germany at GSES. And this is the group that works to secure funding for core operations, and that core funding comes from the U.S. National Science Foundation, from the German government, and from the University of Michigan. This core funding does not cover the data collection. As I mentioned, the country collaborators are covering that, but this group instead is covering personnel costs, as well as things like meeting costs, event costs, and other core project costs. This group advises over, collects, checks, harmonizes, or processes the data and reports. It disseminates the data sets and the reports. It maintains the website where you can access the data. It implements a communication strategy, plans events. It recruits and engages country collaborators. It supports the planning committee, but it also supports users and tracks use. So this is the sort of heart of the organization. And then there are the users. And the users are sort of the lifeblood of the organization, right? These are the people like you who make use of the data to identify and publish new discoveries on these questions that we've been talking about, to raise questions about the data and methodology, to make suggestions. So the CSES project is happy to hear from you if you have questions about the data set or the reports, the technical documentation, or if you have suggestions for things that the project should consider in the future. Prior to every round's module development, as I mentioned, there's this public call for proposals, and we're happy to hear from anyone and everyone about what content should be included in the project. And then some members of the user community are also using the project's resources for teaching. So just a note that the data can be used not only for your own work, but also in exercises that you engage your students in. And that constitutes the full CSES community. And that is where I'm going to stop and take questions.
So we can take questions in the chat or in the Q&A. Just type them in and we'll make sure that they get to Liz. But Liz, let me ask you a kind of administrative question.
Yep.
Which is, what is the mechanism for obtaining data? Is it self-directed? A person has to go to the website and download it themselves? Do you have a servicing staff? Is there some other way that somebody could get access to the data?
So you will just go to the website and indicate whether or not you have already registered or you need to register. And the reason that we ask you to register is just so we can track the user community, not track in the sort of negative way that could come across, but rather just keep data on who's using the data. And then you can download the data. So in fact, I can just share my screen real quick and show you all this. Give me just a second to pull it up. So here I am on the CSES website, and I've already clicked to download data. But if I go back, you can see that I click here. It asks me if I need to register or if I've already registered. You might imagine I've already registered, so I'm going to click here, and that's going to allow me to go forward to these options. Now, what are these options? Well, I can download data from any of the modules 1 through 5. Just if I'm interested in just one module, like we were talking about module 2, or I can download data from the integrated module dataset, the IMD, which is a fairly new resource that the Secretariat has created for the project. It's a tremendous resource because it is the whole enchilada. It is all of the countries in election study. It's all the election studies harmonized into one data set. So then you would just continue to click through. You'll get a description, and then here you can see that you'll get the you'll begin to get to the data as you sort of click on through. So I won't click all the way through, but you can see over here what you're going to need. You can get the data in different formats: R, SAS, SPSS, Stata. Don't forget to download the code book and look at the other documentation. A lot of times I think, well, I don't know about those who are here, but I will say that when I started off in this profession, I had a tendency to just take data off the shelf and start using it because I was so excited to run my regressions. I knew what I wanted to do. I've learned since that it's really good to look at study documentation, to look at the technical report, to look at the code book, to have an understanding of the broader context in which the variables that you're interested in were collected. So now that I know a lot more about opinion formation, I know that opinions are affected by environments. That's something that we were just talking about, right? That I was just talking about how opinions are shaped by context. And in that sense, an interview is a context. So a questionnaire is a context. So if you're interested in a question that's asked halfway through a questionnaire, you might want to know what was asked before that question in order to fully understand the context in which the person is offering their opinion on that question. So just a plug for downloading not only the data, but also the code book and technical information that'll help you understand the data.
And do you also, the project, maintain a bibliography? If I had a kind of a general interest and I wanted to know either what else had been done in that area or whether my particular idea had been studied in this data set by somebody else, could I research that?
Yes, there is a bibliography on the CSES website. And if you click through the website, you'll find it. Thanks, Mike, for asking this. There's a bibliography that contains over 1,000 publications and presentations that we know use CSES data. It's probably incomplete because it's hard to, some of this relies on, very good sort of search tools, and also on users letting us know when they've used the data. So if you use the data, please reach out to the project and let us know. We even have an online form on that bibliography page where you can fill out that form and let us know sort of what's missing from the bibliography, whether it's something that you just developed and presented or published, or something that you came across that you know is not in our bibliography. But it's a pretty good resource for looking at what's being done, and it includes a lot of conference papers too, so things that may not be published yet, as well as dissertations and other things that may not easily come up under other searches.
There's a question from a audience member. Thank you for introducing such a good data set and project. If I remember correctly, you had different response time after elections in your graph on the x-axis. Are the exact response time or location available in the data set?
So thanks for asking that, and thanks for reading that out, Mike. What you can get is the survey date. I don't think in the data set that there is timing data that goes down to sort of hour or timing of questions. That kind of thing is more feasible if the entire survey project is done with electronic devices, but this is a project that dates back to the 1990s, so that's not the case for the whole database, and it's also not even the case, to present day, because the surveys are conducted in using different modes, which is another reason to consult the technical information, because when you bring together a global data database like this, a project, you have election studies that are being conducted by way of different modes. So some are conducting them by phone, and some are conducting them face to face. The criterion that is common to all of them and required is that they are probability-based samples. So they're representative of the frame that they are attempting to represent, the nation effectively, and they are probability-based. So I went a little bit beyond the question, but the question was asking about, just to repeat, that graph I showed and what's in the data set and the date of the surveys in the data set. So it's one of the things that the CSES project is really good about, is providing like a lot of additional data on the data. So you don't just have answers to a 10 to 15 minute questionnaire, you have those plus a host of other data, including these metadata. In other words, is data on the data themselves.
And I wanted to ask you a question about whether you could give some examples of the institutional or the contextual data that you have. So you had this hypothesis about support for democracy and whether it declined the time after an election. How about if that were a dependent variable, but the independent variable, the hypothesis I wanted to test had an independent variable that was the representation system. For example, whether there was a list system or individual representatives elected from defined districts, right?
Yep, yep.
Could you
So
say something about whether and what kinds of those measures are available?
yeah, so you're going to be able to find data on the electoral system. You're also, I should note, not only going to be able to find data on the electoral system and national level data, but also districts, right? So there's a lot that's in there. I'm trying to think of sort of where to point you to for a list of what's in there. Let's see.
Might be in a code book or.
Yeah, it is there. In fact, there's even different codes for what's in there, but let me just see if I can pull up. Okay, so just to give you an example of some of the data on the electoral systems. So open or closed lists, electoral thresholds, compulsory voting, the nature of the electoral formula, whether or not it's proportional representation, first past the post, or mixed, the election type, right? And then there are other data that are already added in from other projects. So I mentioned the bridging variables, but we also add in data. So for example, in module 3, you'll find, just as an example, there are Freedom House indicators, polity indices, population in the year of the election and the 2 preceding years. The Human Development Index data is already in there, corruption perception index, effective number of party measures, government expenditures on health and military. So as you can see, it's like a hard question for me to answer in terms of what's there because it's a lot. But the website contains information on all of this. So if you go to the website, and I can try pulling it up, but some of you are probably already there. So I will say, if you're already there and you found it, the list, go ahead and pop it into the chat, because I know that as I'm talking, some of you are like, if you're like me, you're clicking away and you're probably already there. There's a, and if you're not, because you're just being shy, I'm going to put in a web link for everyone. So if you go to this part of the website, and now I'll share and go there. So here is this variable table, which I got to by clicking on download data and then selecting variable table, sorry. You can see here the possibility of looking at the administrative variables that are in the data set. It's going to be long, so let me go back up. The demographic variables, the survey module variables, the district variables, and then these macro level variables. So here, if we look at this, this is going to tell you for each module whether or not we had, for example, the number of parties participating in the election. So that's there. Where are these data coming from? In some cases, they're coming from collaborator reports. So when the collaborators submit their data sets, they submit a report that is one source of some of the information that we're including in the data set. In other cases, the Secretariat is accessing other databases to answer these questions. But here we have effective number of electoral parties. I mentioned that before, and so on. And it just goes on and on. The year that the parties are founded, the ideological family of parties. What else might be of interest to people? Left-right positions. Populism scale from this last module, percentage of vote that the lower house party and the different parties got in the lower house election, upper house. I'm probably making some people's eyes go nuts by scanning through it, but the point is there's a lot there. It's really quite an amazing database.
Other questions from participants in the audience? You mentioned something about events, Liz.
Mhm.
Do you organize meetings or conferences of people who have done analysis with the data set, or
Yeah.
planning meetings, or?
So a couple ways to connect to the project in that sense. There are sometimes panels that are put together for our standard conferences that feature CSES data. So those might be panels that are initiated by the project itself, or just by people who are kind of affiliates of the project or using project data. We attached to some of our planning committee meetings will have so workshops or very small mini conferences in which we'll invite people to present projects using CSES data. If you do publish something using CSES data, you can also propose it, nominate it to be considered for a prize that the project gives away every year. This is the Klingemann Prize for best use of CSES data. You can find more information on that on the project website. And that the winner of that prize will deliver a talk at a conference event. So we'll sort of plan a meeting and a celebration around that to recognize the winner of the prize. We had to pause that for the last couple of years, so we will probably have a panel at a conference in the near future that features some of the recent winners in their research. The website also will direct you, if you click through it, to a blog. And that blog is pretty neat because it'll it's an opportunity for people who are members of the project community to kind of provide the rest of the community a bit of a sense of what they're up to, whether it's their research or their contributions. So one of the things I like about the blog is that we have this new collaborator spotlight. So when a new collaborator comes into the project, we will ask them to sort of write a short introduction to kind of, who they are, and work with us on that. And we'll put up a blog post to introduce that newest collaborator. But we also use that to spotlight research that's won, for example, the Klingemann Prize, and we use it to discuss decisions that the planning committee and the group of collaborators collectively make. So sometimes you might be wondering why did the project do X? Sometimes these questions come up because you're using the data set and you saw that there was a question or a set of questions in one module and it's not there in the next module, and you're wondering why is that not the case, or why, what happened, where did it go? And sometimes you can find the answer in the project blog, because there you'll find sometimes sort of summaries of discussions of the project collaborators have had, or subcommittee reports. So the one I'm thinking of at the moment as an example is I was on a subcommittee a number of years ago that made the proposal. This was voted on by the whole plenary, the entire group of collaborators involved in the project, but made a proposal to drop the political knowledge questions that had been part of the project. These questions had actually varied in form across several waves of the project, never succeeding in realizing what they were intended to realize, which is a module that taps into political knowledge in some way that is reliable and valid in a cross-national context. So we did a lot of work on this. We did not want to get rid of the module, but the data led us to the answer we arrived at, which is that in a project like this, it's very difficult to come up with a standard set of questions that effectively taps this concept of political knowledge in the same way across countries. At the same time, the project is constantly facing constraints in terms of the length of the module, right? We all want to ask 500 questions. We can't, we have to ask far fewer than that. So we viewed this as an opportunity to create room by getting rid of a module that was really only working in theory. Like in theory, those of us who research public opinion and political behavior know that political knowledge is a really important driver of all sorts of outcomes. But in practice, the data were not ideal. So if you, for example, were someone who was using the database and was wondering like, why were there political knowledge questions in this wave, and then there are political knowledge questions in a different wave, but they're actually a different set of political knowledge questions. That was the experimentation phase. Why are they gone, from later modules? That answer is in both subcommittee reports that are available from the project, but also kind of condensed into a shorter discussion in the blog on the website. That may be more weedy than some of you who are here are interested in, but it's super fascinating to be a part of a project that is a living project that's making decisions every round on what to include and really being evidence-based about it.
It's even more complicated when you engage in conversations about whether the concept that you want to measure is knowledge or sophistication.
That is a fair point.
No, and then the measurement gets all the more complicated, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, in the end, it's funny you should say that, because in the end, we sort of pivoted and said, look, you can use education and political interest to sort of jointly somehow create a measure of that broader concept of political sophistication. So if you're disappointed with the lack of political knowledge items on the survey going forward, rest assured you have this approach, which is to use education and political interest. Now that won't make everyone happy, but that did come up in that effort. So we did drop political knowledge, but we would argue that you do have the capacity to still measure political sophistication by combining education and political interest somehow, as you see fit, in other words.
Right. We have a few more minutes. If there are questions from anybody in the audience for Liz about the data or about the research, the findings derived from the data.
And ask anything, people. I may not have the answer, but I'm happy to hear from you what your questions are.
And I didn't look carefully whether in your slide deck, which we'll also make available, you had included your contact information, Liz, either your email or.
I don't know that I have it there, but I'll put it into the chat and then I can put it on the slides before I give it to you.
Okay.
You can email me if you want to follow up at this email address.
Great.
And you can also contact there's other contact information on the project website. One of the things that those people who are here who are thinking of themselves as users of the data set might really want to keep in mind is that there are living people behind the project who work full-time on the project. This is the secretariat, and some of them are in part-time positions, but collectively they work full-time, and they are available to answer questions that you might have as you're trying to use the data. So if you're stumbling over something, trying to understand the weights, the survey weights, or or something seems missing from the documentation or whatever it is, just you shoot us an email. I can't tell you how happy people who are associated with this project are to see the project's data being used. So don't think, oh, I don't want to bother them. We want to be bothered because we'd like to know that you're using the data.
Well, I think we might have overwhelmed many members of the audience, but they know how to
send them into silence.
But they know how to engage after the presentation is over. And of course, remember that the presentation has been recorded and it'll be put up on the summer program's YouTube channel. So you can go back and refresh yourself on parts of the presentation. I want to thank you, Liz, for this very interesting and detailed presentation. The CSES is a very important project, producing a lot of useful data for people who are interested in the study of contemporary politics and public opinion. So thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me here. And thanks to those who are attending. I know that it's not the same as coming to an in-person presentation, but I hope that if you haven't yet engaged with a scholarly community or a member of the scholarly community who's working with the data, that you'll come across them at conferences and engage with us. But I also hope that you either are or will be someone who's using the project data. So onward you go to great discoveries.